The Galactic Collaborative Science Initiative prided itself on assembling the finest minds from across 17 star systems to tackle the universe's most challenging mysteries. Their current expedition to Kthos 9, a volatile world on the outer rim of the Tandorian sector, represented peak interstellar cooperation. Or at least, that was what the mission briefing claimed. In reality, throwing together a Vrelian navigator who communicated through pheromone bursts, a Korix engineer whose crystalline body refracted light in disorienting patterns, a Thalnese biologist who needed to submerge in moisture pods every 6 hours, and a human who apparently got hired because someone checked the wrong box on a requisition form, was less peak cooperation and more administrative chaos with a budget. Kthos 9 earned its reputation honestly. The planet rotated through 3 different climate zones daily due to its erratic orbit around a binary star system, which meant morning might gift you with temperate breezes, while evening delivered Arctic hellscapes or superheated wastes. The expedition's goal involved studying the resilient fungal colonies that somehow thrived in this meteorological nightmare, colonies that might hold secrets to agricultural sustainability across hostile worlds. Noble goal, terrible location, questionable team composition. Vrik's commander Orthanel, the mission's navigator and self-appointed leader, had insisted their technology could handle anything Kthos 9 threw at them. The Vrelian's segmented exoskeleton gleamed with embedded sensors that supposedly predicted weather patterns with 98% accuracy. Engineer Blixnoth, whose crystalline form hummed with electromagnetic confidence, had designed their camp's defensive grid to withstand wind speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. Researcher Thys brought enough Thalnese bio-monitoring equipment to track every microbe within a 50-kilometer radius. Their camp resembled a technological fortress, bristling with sensors, generators, force fields, and enough backup systems to make a paranoid artificer weep with joy. Then there was Kael Torres, the human, the expedition's survival specialist, though nobody seemed clear on why a survival specialist was necessary when they had 17 different types of emergency beacons and enough automated systems to run a small space station. Kael spent most briefings nodding quietly while the others explained their sophisticated equipment, occasionally asking questions so basic they made Orthanel's antenna twitch with poorly concealed disdain. Questions like what happens if the generators fail, or do we have manual backups, received responses ranging from condescending lectures about redundancy protocols to outright laughter. Blixnoth actually chimed, a crystalline laugh that sounded like breaking glass, when Kael suggested packing physical fire-starting equipment. The storm arrived on day 4 with absolutely zero respect for Vrelian prediction algorithms. Orthanel's sensors detected nothing unusual until the wall of churning atmosphere appeared on the horizon like an angry god having a bad day. Within minutes, wind speeds climbed from gentle 20-kilometer breezes to howling 200-kilometer gales that treated the camp's defensive grid like a mildly annoying suggestion. The sky turned 17 shades of threatening, cycling through green-black clouds, purple lightning networks, and what appeared to be horizontal rain moving fast enough to strip paint from metal. Reinforcing defensive perimeter, Blixnoth announced, his crystalline form pulsing with increased energy flow. Systems operating at maximum capacity. Maximum capacity lasted approximately 45 seconds before the first generator exploded in a shower of sparks that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so catastrophically inconvenient. The defensive grid flickered, struggled, then died with an electronic whimper that barely registered over the storm's roar. Kthos 9's wind, apparently offended by the notion of force fields, proceeded to demonstrate why natural phenomena didn't care about engineering degrees. The shelter pods, designed to withstand extreme conditions through a combination of molecular bonding and aerodynamic profiling, discovered that extreme conditions was a relative term that didn't account for Kthos 9's particular brand of meteorological violence. One by one, they tore from their foundations, tumbling across the landscape like expensive crew-containing dice. This's moisture pod shattered against a rock formation, sending bioluminescent fluid cascading across the camp. The food synthesizers, which had smugly produced nutritional paste for 3 days straight, crumpled under debris. Communication arrays snapped like dried twigs. Backup systems failed to back up anything except the expedition's growing sense of doom. Kael, strapped into the emergency bunker that everyone had mocked during setup, watched through a reinforced viewport as millions of credits worth of cutting-edge technology became very expensive garbage. The human had suggested digging the bunker deeper and reinforcing it with local materials. Orthanel had vetoed this, explaining in excruciating detail how their molecular anchor system made additional precautions unnecessary. The molecular anchor system currently decorated a cliff face 300 meters away, its anchoring properties severely compromised by no longer being anchored to anything. The storm raged for 6 hours, which Kthos 9's rotation cycle meant transitioning through 2 different climate zones while being thoroughly destroyed. The team experienced high-velocity frozen precipitation, boiling rain, and what could only be described as aggressive fog that somehow achieved structural damage capacity. By the time the wind finally exhausted its fury and wandered off to terrorize some other region, the camp looked less like a scientific installation and more like a case study in optimistic planning. Dawn broke over devastation that would make disaster assessment teams weep. The shelter pods had been reduced to twisted frames barely recognizable as their former selves. Generator cores lay scattered across the landscape, their power cells cracked and leaking exotic chemicals that definitely weren't supposed to mix with Kthos 9's atmosphere. The food synthesizers resembled modern art sculptures, assuming the artist's message involved apocalyptic failure. Every communication device sat in various states of destroyed, ranging from completely shattered to technically intact but thoroughly useless. The emergency beacon, their lifeline to orbital rescue, blinked pathetically from beneath a pile of rubble, its transmission array pointed at the ground in what seemed like electronic depression. Orthanel's sensors hung limply from their mounting points, giving the Vrelian commander a distinctly bedraggled appearance as the insectoid leader surveyed the wreckage. "This is unprecedented. My predictive algorithms accounted for every documented storm pattern in this sector." "Perhaps Kthos 9 didn't read the documentation," Kael offered, emerging from the bunker with a pack slung over one shoulder. The human looked annoyingly intact, not a hair out of place, which would have been more irritating to the others if they weren't so busy being cold, wet, and thoroughly miserable. Blixnoth's crystalline form had cracked in 3 places, compromising the engineer's ability to regulate internal temperature. The defensive grid should have held. The calculations were flawless. "Calculations don't argue with hurricanes," Kael said, already moving through the debris field with purpose that suggested actual planning rather than aimless wandering. This huddled miserably in the remains of a shelter pod, the Tholnese biologist's skin already showing signs of dangerous dehydration. "We need moisture pods. Climate control. The emergency beacon needs repair, but without power cells we cannot signal orbital rescue. We have perhaps 2 days before my biological requirements become critical. This is a disaster." The word disaster felt insufficient. This was a catastrophe, a calamity, a complete systemic failure that would generate investigation reports for years. They had lost everything except the emergency bunker, and whatever supplies hadn't been scattered across 5 square kilometers of hostile terrain. No shelter, no power, no food production, no climate control, no functioning technology whatsoever. 3 of the galaxy's finest scientific minds stood in the ruins of their expedition, equipped with useless equipment and training that never covered what to do when everything explodes. How long until rescue? Kthos asked, already knowing the answer would hurt. Orthanel's antenna drooped. Standard protocol requires 72 hours without beacon contact before initiating search operations. Given our remote location, actual rescue arrival estimates at 5 to 7 days. 5 to 7 days, Kthos repeated, the words barely above a whisper. Without shelter, without food, without climate control in a hostile environment that cycles through extreme conditions every 8 hours. We will not survive. The 3 aliens stood in collective despair, their combined centuries of education and advanced technology utterly useless against the simple problem of survival. They had been taught to operate machines, interpret data, solve complex equations, but nobody had thought to teach them how to not die when the machines stopped working. Kael, meanwhile, had been walking an expanding spiral pattern around the camp ruins, occasionally stopping to examine debris, poke at scattered supplies, or study the surrounding landscape. The humans' behavior confused the others, who were too busy despairing to notice their survival specialist actually specializing in survival. "What are you doing?" Orthanel finally asked, watching Kael drag a twisted metal frame toward a partially intact section of shelter wall. "Surviving," Kael replied, which wasn't particularly helpful, but was technically accurate. "First problem is shelter. We need protection from the elements before the next climate cycle hits. Our shelter pods are destroyed," Kthos pointed out, gesturing at the wreckage with a fractured limb. "Without power tools and fabrication equipment, reconstruction is impossible." "Your shelter pods are destroyed," Kael agreed, dropping the metal frame against the wall, "which is why we're not reconstructing them. We're building something that doesn't need a power supply." The humans' plan, laid out with calm confidence that bordered on insulting given their circumstances, involved using the ruins themselves as raw materials. Kael explained this while pulling intact panels from destroyed pods, salvaging support beams, collecting scattered tarp material. The aliens watched with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly contemptuous. "You propose to build a shelter from wreckage," Orthanel said flatly, "without automated construction systems or molecular bonding technology." "Correct. Using primitive assembly methods, if by primitive you mean methods that don't require electricity." "Yes." Thais made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a croak. "This is absurd. We are scientists, not construction workers. We cannot simply stack materials and expect structural integrity." Kael looked up from sorting metal panels by size. "Can you think of a better option? Because I'm open to suggestions that don't involve freezing to death while we wait for rescue." Silence greeted this question, the kind of heavy silence that comes from having absolutely no counter-argument, but being too proud to admit it. The humans set to work with efficiency that suggested extensive practice. Kael identified a spot where 2 partially collapsed shelter walls formed a natural corner, providing foundation and wind protection. Using intact panels as walls and the metal frame as support structure, the human began assembling a basic enclosure. No power tools, no automated systems, just manual labor and practical understanding of weight distribution and structural stability. The aliens watched, initially offering commentary that ranged from helpful observations to outright mockery. Blixnoth questioned every joint connection. Orthanel insisted the angles were mathematically unsound. The Sys predicted immediate collapse. Kael ignored them all, focused on the work with practiced hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Salvaged tarp material became weatherproof covering, secured with debris-scavenged fasteners, and good old-fashioned knots that made Blixnoth crystalline form pulse with what might have been confusion or horror. Metal panels formed walls, angled to deflect wind rather than resist it directly. Support beams, torn from destroyed pods, created a frame that distributed weight across multiple points. The whole structure looked nothing like the sleek, technology-dependent shelter pods. It looked rough, improvised, held together with determination and practical physics rather than molecular bonding. It also looked like it might actually work. "This cannot possibly provide adequate protection," Orthanel insisted, examining a corner joint that consisted of metal panels wedged together and secured with salvaged wire. "Won't know until we test it," Kael said, hammering a support beam into place with a rock, an actual rock used as a tool, which made all three aliens twitch. 2 hours later, the shelter stood complete. Rough, ugly, assembled from disaster remains, but standing nonetheless. The structure measured roughly 4 meters square, large enough for the entire team with room for supplies. Walls angled to deflect wind, roof slanted to shed rain, entrance positioned to minimize exposure during opening. It wouldn't win architectural awards, but architecture wasn't the goal. Survival was. The temperature had been dropping steadily, Kthos 9's rotation carrying them toward another climate cycle. Already the air bit with cold that promised freezing conditions within hours. The aliens huddled miserably, their bodies adapted to climate-controlled environments and utterly unprepared for actual weather. "We require heat," Kthos stated, which ranked among the more obvious observations in galactic history. "Power cells are depleted," Blixnoth added. Emergency heating units were destroyed. Without energy sources, thermal regulation is impossible. Kael had been gathering specific debris during shelter construction, assembling a collection of materials that seemed random to alien eyes. Dry organic matter from local vegetation, broken furniture components from destroyed habitation pods, fragments of packing materials. The human arranged these in the shelter's center, in a shallow depression dug into the ground. "What are you doing now?" Orthanel asked, watching the human stack materials in a careful configuration. "Making fire." 3 alien minds processed this statement. "Fire," Blixnoth repeated slowly. "You mean combustion?" "Uncontrolled oxidation reactions. Controlled, actually, but yes. That is a primitive energy generation method used by pre-industrial civilizations," Kthos said, their tone suggesting Kael had just proposed traveling by animal-drawn cart. "We have plasma generation technology. We have fusion cells. We have photon-reactive heating elements." "Had," Kael corrected. Past tense. "Currently, we have sticks and determination." The human produced a small kit from that mysteriously intact pack, extracting items that looked like they belonged in a museum. A piece of flint, a metal striker. Neither required batteries, power cells, or plasma generators. Kael struck them together, producing sparks that seemed almost magical to beings who had never considered fire as anything other than a dangerous chemical reaction to be avoided. Sparks caught on carefully prepared tinder, organic fluff that smoldered, then glowed, then reluctantly birthed actual flame. Kael fed it carefully, adding larger materials gradually, coaxing the fire from fragile beginnings to steady burning. Within minutes, Actual combustion provided actual heat inside their salvage shelter. The aliens stared like they were witnessing sorcery. "This is fire," Orthanel said unnecessarily, antenna quivering. "You created fire. Without technology. Technically, I created conditions where fire could create itself," Kael replied, adding more fuel. "Fire's been creating itself for billions of years. We just helped it along." Blixnoth extended a fractured limb toward the flames, crystalline structure refracting the light in dancing patterns. "The thermal output is remarkable, inefficient compared to plasma generation, but given our circumstances, efficiency is less relevant than functionality. It will consume oxygen," Kthos observed, though the biologist had already moved closer to the warmth. "The shelter isn't airtight," Kael explained, adjusting the fuel arrangement. "Plenty of ventilation. Fire needs oxygen. We need oxygen, so we both benefit from air circulation. Just don't seal us in, and we'll be fine." The humans' calm competence was starting to become annoying, primarily because it highlighted how thoroughly useless the aliens' advanced education had become. They could calculate orbital mechanics, design molecular structures, analyze biological systems, but apparently none of that helped when you needed to not freeze to death. Heat radiated from the fire, transforming the shelter from desperate refuge into actually habitable space. The aliens crowded closer, their bodies gratefully soaking up warmth that didn't require power cells or energy grids. Kael tended the flames with practiced ease, maintaining steady heat without waste, managing fuel consumption, creating a sustainable burn that would last through the night. "I have questions," Orthanel said eventually, watching flames dance. "How did you learn this?" "Earth," Kael replied simply. "Humans spent most of their existence without advanced technology. We learned to work with what was available. But your species has achieved spaceflight," Blixnoth pointed out. "You have access to the same technology we do. Having technology doesn't mean forgetting everything that came before. Some of us maintain old skills. You know, just in case all the fancy equipment breaks." The pointed comment hung in the warm air, unspoken, "I told you so," radiating louder than words. Warmth was good, shelter was good, but hunger, as Thighs helpfully reminded everyone, remained a pressing concern. The food synthesizers lay in ruins, their molecular assembly systems scattered across the landscape in expensive pieces. Emergency rations had been stored in containers now buried under rubble or scattered by wind. The team's collective stomachs, regardless of species, communicated their displeasure with increasing urgency. "We have perhaps 2 days before nutritional deficiency becomes critical," Thighs reported, running biological scans with one of the few working pieces of equipment. "The synthesizers are irreparable without replacement parts. Emergency rations are largely lost. We face starvation," Kael said, standing and grabbing that ever-present pack. "We could eat." "With what food?" Orthanel demanded. "Our supplies are destroyed. You're here studying fungal colonies, remember? Biology, ecosystems, things that grow." The 3 scientists exchanged glances that communicated their shared thought. Surely the human wasn't suggesting what they thought the human was suggesting. Kael was absolutely suggesting exactly that. The human departed the shelter, venturing into the surrounding landscape with confidence that suggested familiarity despite being on-world for only 4 days. The aliens followed, partly from curiosity, partly from disbelief, partly because sitting around being hungry seemed worse than watching Kael's inevitable failure. Except failure didn't materialize. Kael moved through the terrain with purpose, examining plants, checking soil, occasionally digging up roots or collecting specimens. The human explained while working, pointing out indicators of edibility, warning signs of toxicity, methods of identification that relied on observation rather than scanning equipment. "These tubers are safe," Kael said, unearthing several knobby vegetables, similar to ones we catalogued on day 2. Remember, Kthos's biological scans confirmed non-toxic proteins and carbohydrates suitable for most species. Kthos did remember, vaguely, noting those scans in a report that seemed pointless when they had functioning food synthesizers. Those are unprocessed biological matter, also known as food. We cannot simply consume raw planetary vegetation, Blixnoth protested. There are preparation requirements, sterilization protocols, nutritional optimization. Kael held up one of the tubers. This is already sterile enough. And optimization doesn't matter if we starve. The human continued foraging, collecting an assortment that would have made any Earth survival instructor proud. Edible fungi, identified through careful comparison with catalog data. Protein-rich insects, which made all 3 aliens recoil in horror until Kael pointed out they ate processed insect proteins in synthesized form regularly. Leafy plants confirmed safe through Kthos's earlier research. Water collected from a spring that geological scans had marked as potable. They returned to the shelter with enough raw materials for an actual meal, though the aliens remained deeply skeptical. Kael arranged the ingredients with the care of someone who had done this countless times. The fire, which had been maintained at steady heat, became a cooking surface using flat rocks positioned in the flames. The human cleaned the tubers using salvaged water and a cloth, sliced them using a knife from that magical pack, arranged them for roasting. Fungi joined them, along with the leafy plants, and yes, the insects, though Kael mercifully processed those into something less visibly bug-like. This is how pre-industrial societies prepared nutrition, Thanel observed, watching vegetables cook on hot stones. This is how people eat when the machines break, Kael countered, turning a tuber to ensure even cooking. The smells began hesitantly, then with increasing confidence. Roasting vegetables released sugars that caramelized on hot stone. Fungi developed complex aromatics. Even the processed insects contributed savory notes that, divorced from their origin, actually smelled appealing. The aliens' stomachs, initially repulsed by the concept of unprocessed food, began reconsidering their position. Kael served the meal on salvaged plates, distributing portions with careful attention to each species' nutritional requirements. The presentation lacked synthesizer precision, but quantity and variety compensated for aesthetic shortcomings. The aliens stared at their plates like they'd been served actively dangerous substances. "It won't poison you," Kael said, already eating. Kthos confirmed everything safe days ago. "It's just food. Unprocessed food," Kthos corrected, but the biologist was already reaching for a roasted tuber. First bites came cautiously, suspiciously, prepared for disaster. Instead, they discovered something unexpected. It actually tasted good. Not synthesizer bland nutritional paste, but actual flavors, complex combinations of sweet, savory, earthy notes that their species' taste receptors hadn't experienced in generations. The textures varied, offering sensory interest beyond uniform paste consistency. Blixnoth made a sound like chiming crystals. "This is remarkable. It's dinner," Kael replied, but smiled slightly. They ate in hungry silence, the kind that comes from genuine physical need being satisfied. The fire crackled, providing warmth and light. The shelter, rough and improvised, kept the cold night air at bay. Their stomachs filled with food that grew from the ground, rather than being assembled molecule by molecule. Outside, Kthos 9 cycled toward another climate shift, wind picking up, temperature dropping further. Inside the salvaged shelter, 4 beings from different worlds shared a meal around a fire, the most primitive and most essential of survival tools. "I have a confession," Orthanel said eventually, setting down an empty plate. "I may have underestimated the value of your skill set. You mocked everything I suggested during mission planning," Kael pointed out, not unkindly. "Yes, well, my predictive algorithms failed to account for comprehensive technological failure. An oversight, understatement of the galactic cycle," Blixnoth chimed. "We were utterly unprepared for survival without our systems." Kthos had been quiet, the Thalnese biologist staring into the fire with an expression that might have been contemplation. "We rely entirely on technology. When it fails, we have nothing. But humans, you maintain these skills. Why?" Kael fed another branch into the fire, considering the question. "Because technology fails. Not always, not often. But it happens, and when it does, you need fundamentals. Shelter, fire, food, water. The basics don't require power cells. We learn advanced sciences," Orthanel mused. "Spend years mastering complex systems. But we forget the simple things. The simple things keep you alive when complex systems explode in storms," Kael said, which was both accurate and a gentle reminder of how thoroughly their fancy equipment had failed them. The fire burned lower, embers glowing in the darkness. Outside, wind howled through Kthos 9's latest climate tantrum, but inside their improvised shelter, the team remained warm, fed, and reasonably comfortable. 5 to 7 days until rescue, but suddenly those days seemed survivable rather than a death sentence. Morning arrived with Kthos 9's typical meteorological mood swings, but the shelter held, the fire rekindled easily, and Kael's foraged breakfast proved that yesterday's meal wasn't a fluke. The following days fell into a pattern of basic survival, maintaining shelter, managing fire, finding food, tasks that seemed almost primitive to beings accustomed to technology doing everything for them. But they learned. Orthanel mastered fire tending, discovering satisfaction in maintaining steady heat. Blixnoth studied shelter reinforcement, applying engineering knowledge to practical construction. Kthos became surprisingly adept at identifying edible plants, bringing biological expertise to foraging. Kael taught them all, patiently explaining fundamentals that their educations had skipped entirely, showing them that survival wasn't about having the best equipment, but knowing what to do when equipment became expensive debris. Rescue arrived on day 6, a galactic collaborative science initiative ship, descending through Kthos 9's turbulent atmosphere. The rescue team found 4 survivors huddled around a fire in a shelter built from wreckage, eating roasted vegetables like some sort of primitive camping expedition. The mission commander's report would note the expedition's complete technological failure with appropriate concern while praising the team's survival. It would recommend enhanced survival training for all personnel, particular attention to non-technological solutions, and perhaps listening to humans when they suggested packing manual backup equipment. What the report couldn't quite capture was the irony of 3 of the galaxy's most advanced species, equipped with cutting-edge technology and centuries of scientific education, being saved by methods older than most civilizations. Fire, shelter, foraged food, the fundamentals that humanity never quite forgot, even after reaching the stars. Orthanel, departing Kthos 9 and looking back at their improvised camp, had one final observation: we brought advanced technology to conquer a hostile world. Instead, a human armed with rocks and determination conquered our technological dependence. Kael, overhearing this, simply smiled and added one more piece of wood to the fire before letting it die. The galaxy runs on technology so advanced it borders on miraculous, systems so sophisticated they make natural phenomena seem quaint. Until those systems fail, and someone needs to remember how to make fire with rocks. Turns out, the most primitive species in the expedition knew the most important lesson. Survival doesn't care about your degree, your equipment, or your sophistication. It cares about whether you can stay warm, stay fed, and stay alive when everything else goes wrong. And sometimes, just sometimes, the being everyone dismissed as the backward addition to the team is exactly the one who saves everyone else.